Thanks, guys. Shona's been very modest. Now, I can use a microphone. Can people hear me up down the back?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
If you can't hear me, I'll get a mic out. But I don't want to deafen the people in front. That's the thing. But look, Shona's been way too modest. She's been an incredible help, organised 2 tours around Florida, and I just get up in the morning and I get instructions and I go to a place and I stand up and I talk, and Shona does it. So, it's Kiwis. New Zealanders call ourselves Kiwis after this little flightless bird that lives in our forest. And we pride ourselves in our ingenuity because we have to be ingenious because we're so poor. It's basically we have to use stuff over and over and over and over again. And I know in the Vietnam War, our soldiers used to marvel at the American soldiers and all the technology they had. And we used to make do with all this stuff, recycle stuff and make our own weapons and all that kind of thing. But that spirit's still alive. We're all cousins. We're all part of the same. We're all part of the same family, and we're all facing the same threats. And I'm here. A lot of people ask me, well, tell me who's heard me speak before here? Probably about half of you, or okay. Well, look. The first thing is, I want to speak relatively concisely so people can ask questions. But the first thing people say to me is why I should even care about the politics of this country. I live 12,000 miles away or something. Well, the first reason is basic gratitude, because as Shona will attest, my country was only free because of the huge sacrifices of your fathers and uncles and grandfathers in the battles of Guadalcanal and Midway and the Coral Sea. Without your sacrifice, my country would have been subjugated by the Japanese armies. So there is still that feeling in New Zealand today, that gratitude. But the other reason is a little bit more selfish, but it's related. This is the last best hope of mankind here. Ronald Reagan had it right. If freedom fails in the United States, it fails everywhere. The bad guys of the world, if you lose your military superiority and your world leadership, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Cubans, the Nicaraguans, the North Koreans, and all their crazed allies will basically carve up this globe amongst themselves. Now, I live way down the bottom of the Pacific. Most Kiwis are pretty cocky because they think no one's ever going to bother us. But just 1,500 miles to the north of my country lie the Fijian Islands. It's a beautiful tourist destination. Fiji now has a Marxist government. The Chinese are training the Fijian military and building big hydroelectric dams on the islands. Now, Fiji is now a Chinese client state, and that's happening right throughout the Pacific. Just a few months ago, the Australian Defence Minister was up in China, and a top Chinese defence official embarrassed him hugely. He said, now is the time for Australia to choose. Do you stay under American protection or do you come under Chinese protection? And that would not have happened under Reagan or Bush or even under Clinton. But it's happening now because the bad guys of the world, as we see right now with China and Japan, are getting bolder and bolder all the time. It's all right. I probably don't actually need it, I don't think.
It's that boldness.
Okay, put it away. Yeah, don't worry about it. I think I can boom it out.
All right.
But thanks very much.
They heard you.
And if you look around the world right now, your allies from Israel to Taiwan to Japan to Australia to Britain are freaking out because they look at the leadership coming out of the United States and it looks to them like your president loves the bad guys a lot more than he loves the good guys. That's causing a huge power shift in the world, a huge amount of instability, and if it carries on, it will bring this world into warfare. Reagan had a motto, peace through security. You don't have security, you will not have peace. Mr. Obama seems intent on destroying your national security and all the Western countries' national security. We know the consequences of that. It won't be his sons in uniform fighting the battles. So I want to talk a little bit about, I'll go into Obama. Look, Barack Obama, why is he like he is? Well, I want to talk about some people around Obama who made him like he is today. And I want to start out with a man called Frank Marshall Davis. Anybody heard of dear old Frank? A few of you, okay. Probably watched the movie 2016, some of you. Was even worse than that. Frank Marshall Davis started out as a communist in Chicago in the 1940s. He was a black guy, a poet, a writer, a jazz critic, a journalist. And at that time, the Chicago left, particularly the black left, was very strong, a very vibrant movement. This was the height of the jazz age, and jazz music and communism went together in Chicago. It was a renaissance time for the black left. And Frank Marshall Davis was very much part of that. He was a leader of that movement. But in 1948, he left all the glamour and glitz behind and went out to a little island in the Pacific, or a bunch of islands, Hawaii. And that was a backwater in those days, before the tourist trade, before statehood. So why would Mr. Davis do that? Well, at the time, Comrade Stalin had ordered his loyal slaves in the American Communist Party to put as many comrades as they could get out into Hawaii. Now, what do you think interested Comrade Stalin in Hawaii? It was Pearl Harbor. The same thing that interested the Japanese. Because then, back in those days, as today, your military has been Moscow's #1 focus of interest. Because there's only one thing that stopped them then, and stops them today getting what they want, and that's your military and your ability to fund it, and your willingness to deploy it. So, Frank Marshall Davis was a loyal communist, moved out to Hawaii. He worked for a little publication called the Honolulu Record, Labor Union Journal. His boss was a man called Koji Ariyoshi, Japanese-American communist. During World War II, Ariyoshi had served in China with the United States Army, with Mao Zedong's communist forces fighting the Japanese Imperial Army. After World War II, Ariyoshi went to New York, where he worked with the Amerasia people. Now, Amerasia was a left-wing magazine staffed by communists and several known Soviet KGB agents, and they were working with the secret communists inside your State Department to tilt US foreign policy away from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese towards Mao Zedong's communist Chinese. And because they succeeded in getting your Congress to withdraw military aid to Chiang Kai-shek, the communists took over and 500 million Chinese were delivered to Mao. A small group of American traitors changed world history. And a similar pattern was followed with the fall of Vietnam a few years later. Vietnam wasn't lost in the field. Vietnam was lost in Congress and the State Department. So, Frank had a bit of a hobby out in Hawaii, and the FBI, who watched him for 19 years, he was just a civil rights campaigner, by the way, as the Obama people will tell you. But the FBI watched him for 19 years. They put together a 600-page file on the man. And they were getting reports that Frank Marshall Davis was often seen in obscure Hawaiian beaches taking photographs with a camera with telescopic lenses. And I think they suspected military espionage because they put Frank Marshall Davis on Security Index A. And that was reserved for only the most dangerous communists, and meant that had war ever broken out with the Soviet Union, Frank Marshall Davis would have been arrested that very day. So, about 1970, young Obama comes back from Indonesia and is to study in Hawaii. And his maternal grandfather, Stanley Dunham, decided he needed a black mentor, a father figure to guide him through the teenage years, because there weren't many black people in Hawaii at the time. So he picked his dope-smoking, whiskey-drinking buddy, Frank Marshall Davis, as a suitable mentor to the young man. And Frank Marshall Davis, the man who had written poems praising Stalin, poems praising the Red Army, poems viciously criticising racist KKK America, was considered the suitable candidate. And he had Mr. Obama's ear for about 9 or 10 years, from about the age of 11 to the age of 19. And Barack Obama mentions a man called Frank 22 times in his book Dreams from My Father, as a guide, a mentor, someone he discussed politics with, someone he looked to for guidance. But only ever as Frank, never mentioned his full name. Now, for a man who is as open and transparent as your president, surely that's a little bit out of character. What did he have to hide? Frank Marshall Davis was dead by that time. He wasn't protecting his privacy. So, a lot of people say to me, though, that by that time, Frank Marshall Davis was just a dope-smoking old alcoholic. You know, no big deal, no sweat. But as late as 1970, Frank Marshall Davis, 1979, the year Obama left for Occidental, Frank Marshall Davis was still listed as an endorser of the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign-Born, the Communist Party's main front of the time. And 2 names below Frank Marshall Davis was listed another comrade, a man called Hugh DeLacy, and that name might come up again in the near future. So that was the teenage years. But what about young adulthood? There's a whole lot of mentors in between. But when Mr. Obama decided to run for politics in Chicago as a young lawyer, he got his law degree from Harvard. He was picked up and guided and mentored for several years by an Illinois state senator named Alice Palmer. Now, Alice Palmer and Obama both worked together in the Marxist New Party. That was set up by SEIU, ACORN, and the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a Marxist group. And that was set up to infiltrate the Democrat Party and move it even further to the left. And when I exposed that in 2008, the Obama campaign denied that Mr. Obama had even been a member of it, even though he'd stood for them, he'd been endorsed by them, whatever. Obama wasn't just a member, he founded it, he set it up, a Marxist group. But Alice Palmer decided to run for Congress in 1996, and the deal was she employed Obama as her chief of staff. And she said to Barack, "You get me elected to Congress, and then you can take my state Senate seat." How kind of her. And it was Alice Palmer that took Mr. Obama to the famous meeting in the drawing room of Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dawn in Hyde Park, Chicago, former Weather Underground terrorist leaders. And that was Barack Obama's introduction to the Hyde Park left, the radical leftist cabal that hangs out in Hyde Park, Chicago, the district around the University of Chicago, in the middle of sort of a green oasis or a red oasis in the middle of bleak South Chicago. Is there anybody here from Chicago, by the way, that dares to admit it?
I don't want to admit it.
Okay. It's a great place, but good on you. Okay. Well, you might recognise some of the names that I'm going to say. But anyway, so Alice Palmer, things don't always go smoothly in politics, and Alice Palmer lost the primary. And that was a bit of a blow. So she turned back to Mr. Obama and said, "Look, sorry, Barack, you're going to have to step down because I want my state Senate seat back." And Barack says, "Sorry, Alice, tough, I'm running." And he got her disqualified off the ballot by challenging her signatures, many of which were fraudulent. Fancy that, even in Chicago, eh? Then he got everyone else disqualified as well, so he ran unopposed. But and that caused a big stink on the Chicago left. You know, a big division. And a communist, a Marxist named Timmy All Black, was brought in to try and smooth it over. He was a friend of both Obama and Alice Palmer's, but even he couldn't do it, and the two went their separate ways. But it's fair to say that Alice Palmer was a significant mentor to your president and the woman who got him his first job in politics. But she had a little bit of a history. Back in 1980, Alice Palmer was in